Let's talk through the Part B SpEd timelines document. So if you do not have this printed and or laminated, I would highly suggest that you do both and have it in an easy, accessible spot for you near your desk or somewhere where you're frequently looking or keeping track of your paperwork, as it'll be a resource that you probably refer back to quite a bit. So on this document, you'll see that there are different tasks and then there are timelines associated with them. Anything that's related to a school day is highlighted in blue, and anything related to a calendar day is highlighted in green. So remember the difference between those two are school days are days when students are in instruction. So any days in which students are at school counts as a school day. However, days like professional learning days where only staff are on site, that does not count as a school day because students are not present for instruction. Calendar days, on the other hand, are any day of the calendar. So those include weekends, they include holidays, they include all of the days of the school year or of the calendar year. So school days are students' instructional days, calendar days are any day of the year. So in looking through this, you'll see that it starts with things related to annual IEPs. So IEPs must be written and sent to parents 10 school days from the date of the IEP meeting. So you have 10 school days after a meeting to write the IEP and get it sent home to parents. The start date on the IEP services grid should be 14 calendar days from the date of your prior written notice, because we need to allow for passive consent, which we'll talk about in a little bit. For initial evaluations, you need to complete initial evaluations within 30 school days from the date that you receive consent from the parents. And not only do you need to complete the evaluation task, but you also need to complete the report and make sure that a completed report is sent to the parents within 30 school days. You then have 30 calendar days to hold the initial IEP meeting if the student was found eligible. So sometimes our buildings will combine these meetings into one and will hold a results meeting and an IEP at the same time. And sometimes we find that that's too much for a parent who's initially going through a special ed evaluation. Hearing about all of the evaluation and talking about the IEP gets to be a pretty long meeting. So you can separate those two meetings out and hold them separately. If you do, you just have 30 calendar days to hold that initial IEP meeting. Most teams hold it a little bit sooner than that because it just delays services for students starting, but you do have 30 calendar days to hold an initial IEP meeting. The next things on the list here are related to reevaluations. So for reevaluations, an important thing to remember, you'll see here that it talks about whichever comes first. So when a student has already received an evaluation or already had an IEP, we need to pay attention to those dates. If their last reevaluation was on December 1st, then our next evaluation for them needs to be completed no later than December 1st, 3 years later. Same with their IEP. If their IEP last year was held on December 1st, then we need to hold their IEP for this year on December 1st or sooner. Even if we don't allow ourselves that full amount of time, that's the absolute latest that we can do. So when you start a reevaluation, we recommend that you start that way ahead of time. Use your HENS chart or your 30-day calendar to help plot that out of when you need to send that, to allow yourself passive consent for the parent. So those 14 calendar days. So your start of a reevaluation happens when you get consent from a parent or after 14 calendar days has passed from when you send home the evaluation prior written notice. For reevaluation reports then, you must complete them within 30 school days of either that receipt of consent or the passive consent, or at least before the 3-year reevaluation is due. So it cannot exceed the 3-year evaluation due date. So whichever one of those comes first is the date that you need to use. If you don't allow yourself a full 30 school days to get that evaluation done, then you're in a shorter time frame. So making sure that you're really planning out evaluations much sooner than you think, because the 30 school days does take some time, and you want to make sure that you give yourself that full amount of time to get those evaluations done. Then when you're looking at an annual IEP meeting, again, you need to hold that on or before their previous IEP date. And then you also need to hold that within 10 school days from when you send home a reevaluation report. So if you send home a reevaluation report, you have to hold that annual IEP meeting within 10 school days of sending that eval report home. The most important thing to remember about those reevaluations is looking at your date that it was last done. When was your last reevaluation done? When was your last IEP done? And that making sure that those do not exceed, that you're not exceeding 3 years for the reevaluation, and that you're not exceeding 1 year for the IEP. The last two things on this document talk about things that are related to a timeline, but not necessarily related to school days or calendar days. So the first one is secondary transition evaluation. So no later than the end of students' ninth grade year, we need to have secondary transition evaluation be part of their evaluation. So what this means in our SpEd districts is that students that are due for evaluation in 7th or 8th grade must have secondary transition as part of the evaluation. Students who are due in 6th grade do not, because they will be reevaluated when they are in 9th grade. So starting in 7th grade in our SpEd districts is when we require secondary transition to be part of the evaluation, 7th grade through 12th grade or through age 21. The second or the last thing on this timeline is the notice of transfer of parent rights. So at least 1 year before the student turns 18, we must notify the student and their parent that the rights of the student will transfer to them on their 18th birthday unless we receive court paperwork that shows otherwise. So typically when the student, in whatever IEP falls when the student is turning 17, is the one where you're going to want to fill out that page of the IEP to make sure that the parent and the student are notified that their transfer of rights will happen upon the student's 18th birthday. On the bottom of this document, there's just a couple of notes, so some good reminders and good things to make sure that you are aware of. So the 14-day implied consent, or passive consent as it's frequently referred to, only applies to continuing services. So it only applies to students for reevaluations and annual IEPs. We must have written consent on a prior written notice eval plan or on a prior written notice for any initial evaluations or initial provisions of IEP services. Then the other thing that has the 2 asterisks there are after 10 school days. So 10 school days is a locally established procedure based on the interpretation of reasonable amount of time. So the law says reasonable amount of time, and we have defined that locally and regionally, and I think kind of pretty much across the state, it's being defined as reasonable amount of time is 10 school days. So approximately 2 weeks after you have a meeting is when you need to make sure that paperwork is out to parents. A final important reminder is that when you're counting days, the date of the event is considered day 0, and then the following day is day 1. So if you send a prior written notice on May 1st, that counts as day 0. And when you start counting day 1 then would be on May 2nd. So you're going to look at the next day is always your day 1 of counting.